All right, folks, welcome back. Well, today we start on chapter 5, which is putting it all together. This is the good stuff. So far, we've learned about all the elements that make up design. We've learned about image and different types of imagery. We've learned about typography, how that can be used. We've learned about form and space and negative space and how all these things can influence the viewer on their own. Now that we know all that, we get to put it all together to create a piece of design. And there, at the introductory pages in chapter 5, this spread right here, there are 2 quotes, and both of them are really good. I want you to read those. First one says, "There's no recipe for a good layout. What must be maintained is a feeling of change and contrast." And that is true. There are things that you can start with to get you going, but basically, a layout can be pretty much anything as long as certain things are emphasized and there's focal points and there's sort of a hierarchy. The other quote says, "Begin with the end in mind," and that, I can't tell you how important that is. Whenever you're designing something, you're coming up with a concept, before you even start, before you even turn the computer on and start designing, you need to think about the end result. What do you want to accomplish with this piece? What kind of feeling do you want the viewer to have when they see it? What do you want them to leave with? What do you want the hook to be? And then it's kind of backward designing, I guess. You start at the end. What do you want the result to be? And then you kind of go backwards and say, how do I get there? What steps do I take to get this desired result? Okay, and that's how you really get a good, well thought out design. Okay. So it talks about kind of a visual logic checklist and things you need to do whenever you're starting design. And there's all these things. We've kind of talked about them as we've gone through the semester. But this should be, some of the first things you think about when you do a design should be, first of all, what's the format going to be? Is it going to be vertical, horizontal, square? Is it going to be really big? Is it going to be small? What's the medium going to be? Is it going to be just on the web, or is it going to be a printed piece? If that's the case, what kind of paper do you use? What kind of special printing processes, if any, are you going to use? Whether die cuts or gloss varnishes or something like that. All these different things. Imagery. What kind of images are you going to use? What type of imagery is really going to accentuate the subject matter? Should it be illustration? Should it be realistic photos, black and white photography, collage? All these different things. And then once you kind of get all these pieces together, then you start to lay it out. You start to bring it together, and that is what we're going to talk about: layout and the almighty grid. I don't know if you've heard of this or not, but the grid it's basically underline in every design you see. The grid is everywhere. And I've posted some examples of just, I think they're magazine spreads. And see, you need to start to notice these things. And I've kind of given you a spread, and then I've shown you what it looks like with the grid lines on there. So you can kind of start to visualize these. Some of them are a little bit easier to see than others, but it's generally always there unless, the designer actively tries to not have the grid or break the grid. And, we talk about that next time, or in 2 weeks, about how, why you should break these rules and when, if at all. So the grid basically gives your design this underlying sense of order, sort of a sense of structure. And it's just a great way to help you, especially when you're beginning, to help you lay out pages and start to learn this visual logic of where things will go and how that will affect the rest of the layout. And, the empty spaces are just as important. That's still part of the grid. Because, what's not there is just as important as what's there. If there's empty spaces, that's going to affect the spaces that have information in them and, how that's viewed by whoever's looking at it. Generally, when you're doing a grid, there's a margin on the outside. Let's say we're doing an 8.5 by 11 page. There's usually a margin, maybe a 1/4 inch, going all the way around on the sides and the top and bottom. And that's just to keep kind of all the information in a centralized area. Okay, and so things don't go right up to the edge of the page, unless it's like an image and it's bleeding, off the edge of the page, and that's, we'll talk about that later. But then, a grid can be it's not as structured as you would think. It's not strictly square. Well, I mean, it is strictly squares, but you know, you don't have to have it uniform. You know, I mean, the most obvious example of the grid system is probably a newspaper. If you look at newspapers, it's got, you know, the headline and then columns and little boxes and, you know, all these different elements. And the reason they do that is because, you know, they come out with it every day. So the grid system makes it a lot easier to organize this information as it changes, because they already have a template and they just bring in the copy and, you know, then kind of page it up and bring in images and things like that. So whenever you're creating a grid, you can have, you know, a column could span however you create your grid. It could be, you know, 1/4 inch squares, 1/2 inch squares, 1 inch squares. Doesn't really matter, as long as these elements kind of conform to that. You could have a picture going the whole length or the whole width of the page with, you know, columns underneath it. But if you start to look at it and start to kind of, you know, put lines in it and, you know, square it off, you're going to start to see that these pieces can, you know, line up with each other. Like maybe there's an image up here, and down here, you know, the copy lines up with the edge of the image, or, you know, something like that. You know, and even imagery can be in a grid. One of the examples on the PDF that I've attached is, you know, you can start to see that even the image is part of the grid. Like they had, I think there's one with, I don't know, some kind of piece of farm equipment going out, and you can see that that's actually kept within the grid. And usually this is planned. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes, like a lot of times when I design, I don't really think about the grid too much. I mean, it's always there in the back of my head. But then as I go back and look and I start to, you know, draw these lines around it, I see that I have, you know, kind of kept to this grid pattern. And so it gives this sense of underlying structure, sort of like the Matrix. You know, it's all around us. We don't necessarily see it, but it's there. Maybe that's a bad example. Anyway, so as you go through this chapter, look at these examples of grids and look at the ones that I gave you. And I mean, look in magazine ads. Look on the internet. The internet is very grid based, and that's partially because that's the way you design it. Initially, you know, you designed with tables when you're doing web page layout, which is basically just squares. So you really didn't have anything but grid. Now that we've kind of advanced a little bit, and it doesn't have to be a table-based layout, but that's just, you know, it's a good way to provide organization. You know, you have to create a hierarchy, because you could have an image across the top, and then maybe a content area over here and a sidebar that has navigation or maybe a pull quote or something like that. But it's a really effective way of kind of organizing things. And if you're stuck, if you don't know where to start when you're doing a design, that's a great way to help you get started. Just create a grid. And most layout programs, Quark and InDesign and these kind of things, have grids built into them. You can actually view the grid and it'll pop up automatically, so then you can start playing around with elements and lining them up and seeing. And, you know, and you can break the grid. When you do that, like if you really want to emphasize something, you might have one piece that's not in the same kind of organizational structure as the rest. It breaks the grid. And that's a really good way to emphasize something, because that the reader kind of sees that as, you know, this is the one piece that's not like the rest of the page, so that's automatically where the emphasis is going to go. So just, you know, keep that in mind as you're designing.